Yo, welcome back to Davin Biology. So this is our part 2 video of our mini series of state trial for 2024 SPM. So for chapter 7, as we mentioned in part 1, so if you missed part 1, so you can just click somewhere here to watch it back lah. Okay, that would be Form 4 chapter 4 nucleic acid. So for part 2, cellular respiration. Now this chapter has never came out for our KSSM SPM. So it's a very high possibility punya chapter lah for this year, so don't say I did not warn you lah. Okay, so however we do one non-2024 punya trial because I feel that this question quite important, especially this graph one. You could understand what's happening in this graph because quite common actually this question, but this year's state trial don't have this type. So yeah, I just do one over here. Now, so in this graph, right, x-axis, remember, is the time of your exercise. So here's during exercise, here is after you finish your exercise, and basically, y-axis is your oxygen intake. So they always like to ask you like these two regions, what does it represent over here? As you can see here, the longer we exercise, the more oxygen we intake, which makes sense. However, there's this region that's above the graph. So over here is basically the oxygen that you need during your exercise, which you can see the oxygen required is more than the oxygen intake. Meaning to say you lack of oxygen right now because you use more than what you have, just like you use more money than what you earn right now. So therefore, the answer for this is called oxygen debt because you are lacking of oxygen. You not enough oxygen. Now, but after your workout, you will then need to pay back the oxygen you lack just now. Because remember, as you lack of oxygen, you still need to find ways to produce energy. So that is when lactic acid fermentation occurs. If you're familiar with lactic acid fermentation, it's whereby you break down glucose without using oxygen to get energy. At the same time, it will give you lactic acid. So since you do not use oxygen that time, now you need to pay back the oxygen at Q. So this is called oxygen debt repaid. However, sometimes question will ask you process. If they ask you state the process that occurred at P and Q, now it's a totally different question, different answer. What you have to say here is now, when you lack of oxygen, what is the process that your muscle undergo to get energy? So it's this process over here, right? Which is basically lactic acid fermentation. Don't say anaerobic. And when you finish exercising already, right, you don't lack of oxygen anymore. The oxygen you inhale is enough. So therefore, we undergo normal punya respiration. So if they ask you process, right, the process they undergo here, after your exercise, you're not lacking of oxygen anymore. We undergo aerobic respiration. So over here, you are inhaling oxygen to oxidize glucose properly to get energy, CO2, and water. But at the same time, you breathe in oxygen, there are excess oxygen that you breathe in because here you're not lacking oxygen anymore. So the oxygen you breathe in, right, might be excess. So the excess oxygen you use to then oxidize the lactic acid. So that's called repaying the oxygen debt. Okay. So word equation for biochemical process at A. So biochemical reaction meaning the process lah over here lah. Now in the exam, remember you have the right words. So spell everything: glucose, aero, energy plus lactic acids. Alright, so then next, okay, we still go into this MRSM 2024, this year punya question. Now, one of the most common cellular respiration question, right, besides just now that graph, is this type, right? They give you two example of activities. One is chilling, one is swimming, exercising basically. Then ask you to name the type of respiration. Very simple. This is basically the normal respiration, right? So we call it as aerobic respiration. Now for B, please don't say anaerobic, as I mentioned earlier. You have to say lactic acid fermentation. Word equation for A, just now I wrote for you already lah. So basically is oxygen plus glucose, you get energy, water, carbon dioxide. Just remember in exam, you have to spell everything out. And for energy, better to write 2898 kilojoule energy lah. That will be better. Okay, then B1, they say, muscle cells of individual B are in a state of oxygen deficiency, causes muscle cramp. State the condition of muscle cells. So just like just now, when you are lacking of oxygen, the condition that the muscle is in is called oxygen debt. because you use more than what you require because you need to generate more energy. So sometimes the oxygen you breathe in might not be enough to supply for your activity. So it's called oxygen debt. So when you're in oxygen debt, you will undergo, just now we mentioned, the lactic acid fermentation, whereby you break down the glucose without using oxygen because you not enough oxygen already. So then they ask how the condition occurred. So I think by now most of you should know muscle cramp is caused by accumulation of lactic acid. So if you mention lactic acid, you get 1 mark, which is my last point. Lactic acid accumulates in muscles that cause cramp. Then next you're going to say, now where does this lactic acid come from? Obviously it comes from lactic acid fermentation. So if you mention the process lactic acid fermentation occurs in muscle cell, 2nd mark. Then one more point is why lactic acid fermentation occurred. So which you mentioned just now, because there's oxygen debt. But takkan you repeat the same thing here ma? Because you mentioned that already right just now, so you won't get marks by stating the same thing. So therefore, to get this mark, you got to elaborate what is oxygen debt, which you mentioned earlier. Marks oxygen consumption more than the oxygen supply, means you use more than what you have. So that's exactly what you have to say. No? Oxygen consumption by muscle cells more than oxygen supplied to muscle cells. Easy. You can pause and write this down if you wish to. Then let's go for another one. SBP 2024. So this is basically aerobic respiration, the normal respiration, which actually aerobic respiration, there are 2 processes. Process K and one more, which they didn't mention here. Okay, it's J lah, whatever lah. Okay, so the first process basically is called glycolysis, which glucose is initially being broken down into pyruvate without using oxygen. So just now let's write the equation one more time. Oxygen, glucose, energy, CO2, water. So first the glucose is being broken into pyruvate without using oxygen. So this is called glycolysis. Now once you get the pyruvate, then only this oxygen can oxidize the pyruvate to get these 3 things. So it's a bit like glucose is too fat. Oxygen cannot straight away cut it. So your body has to break down the glucose into pyruvate first, and oxygen only can oxidize it. So by the way, remember, glycolysis, the first process occurs in your cytoplasm. Then the oxidation of pyruvate, the second one, then only occurs in your mitochondria. Yeah, so this basically is called oxidation of pyruvate. So oxidation of pyruvate, what is the gas that you require? Obviously oxygen. Oxidation. So you oxidize the pyruvate using oxygen to get CO2, water, energy. Advantage of the respiration process. So basically aerobic respiration is definitely more advantageous compared to fermentation, because you get more energy. There's no lactic acid that causes cramp, so more energy is generated. No lactic acid produced. Give you another one, which causes cramps. Next, there's an experiment over here. Was done by placing blended bananas with yeast in a closed container. The alcohol content is measured every day and the data is plotted. So basically this is another kind of fermentation called alcohol fermentation. So it's a fermentation that is carried out by plants and yeast. So just like human, plants and yeast also needs oxygen. Sometimes if they lack of oxygen, because you close the container, so there's no oxygen, so you force them to undergo fermentation. But they undergo different kind of fermentation called alcohol fermentation, which produces alcohol in the form of ethanol. So during the first 4 days, you can see that there's no alcohol content, because probably during the first 4 days, there's enough oxygen. But after that, as the oxygen is being used up, being depleted, you can see then there are more and more alcohol being produced, because that's when the yeast starts to undergo alcohol fermentation. Similarly, like lactic acid fermentation, there's no oxygen to break down the glucose, just that the products are different. So state the difference in the process that occur before day 4 and after day 4. So the difference basically, before is normal aerobic respiration. And basically after, we mentioned already, it's alcohol fermentation. Experiment is repeated using an open container. Explain the effect on the volume of alcohol in the container. So it's really using an opened container. So if you open the container, there will be oxygen. Therefore, there won't be alcohol fermentation. There'll be less alcohol lah, basically. So volume of alcohol, of course, will be lesser. Why? Because oxygen is present. And basically, you undergo normal respiration. So aerobic respiration occurs, which do not produce ethanol or alcohol. Okay, now other than this, right, for this one, I just go back to just the question. You can write other things also. So the aerobic respiration and alcohol fermentation, right? You also can say basically there's no oxygen. There's oxygen present. So no oxygen. You can say the energy amount, because they want you the difference in the process that occurs, right? So you can write more energy, or you can write the exact amount, 2898 kilojoule energy. This one, 150 kilojoule. Alcohol fermentation is more than lactic acid fermentation, so it's 210 kilojoule energy. Okay, and that's about it for this question. Let's do another one. Okay, so this one is also yeast again. We use yeast to make bread, all of you know that. And basically, why we use yeast to make bread is because yeast can also undergo, we already mentioned, can undergo alcohol fermentation. Now, but for this case, it's not to get the alcohol, but we know, right, it's to let the dough rise. So for alcohol fermentation, right, you basically produce CO2, ethanol, and energy. So the main product now to make bread obviously is CO2, because CO2 is the gas that make the dough rise. So that is what you got to say over here. So process Z, we already know, alcohol fermentation. Right? Alcohol fermentation is the main process that yeast undergo to make the dough rise. Now, why the dough rise is because of CO2. That's the main thing you have to mention. Okay, if you don't mention CO2, definitely you won't get full marks. Then what's the CO2 for? Rising of dough. Simple as that. Another question settled. Okay, so I think this one is the same as just now, the glycolysis and oxidation of pyruvate one. So this, it's breaking down glucose into pyruvate, so that is the same thing. Glycolysis. Explain process why. You can say glucose is broken down into pyruvate. Literally, that's the 2 marks you have to say. Then you can add more in cytoplasm. That's also can. Okay? Yeah, so remember this process occurs in the cytoplasm. This one baru inside the mitochondria, which is called oxidation of the pyruvate. And we do want a little bit essay over here. Okay, a bit more longer marks in your question. So how organism X in this drink can help in the preparation of yogurt using the above ingredients. So they say I use milk, and also I add organism X inside to produce this yogurt. So yogurt basically uses the concept of lactic acid fermentation. But what undergoes lactic acid fermentation now is not our muscle cell, but something called lactobacillus. So basically, you have milk over here. What you're going to do is you're going to put lactobacillus bacteria inside here, and since there's no oxygen here, it will be forced to carry out lactic acid fermentation. Now, to explain this process, you just have to remember, when milk turns to yogurt, right, what happened to the yogurt? Number one, it becomes sour. Number two, the texture becomes thicker, basically coagulate already. So you're going to explain, how do I get these two? Number one, you can start writing organism X is lactobacillus sp dot. It basically carries out, okay, for here, right, we don't say lactic acid fermentation. You must follow this one in your textbook. You must say milk fermentation. Now here comes the main thing. So basically the lactobacillus, you can say acts on the lactose to produce, number one, lactic acid. So lactic acid is the reason why it's sour. So if you mention I produce lactic acid, that's the first point already. Now then, why is it thicker? Because lactic acid coagulates. Yeah, so this is lactic acid. It coagulates the milk protein, which we call it as casein. Better to write casein, but for this state paper, the marking scheme, they go write milk protein, but better to write casein instead of milk protein because I'm not sure whether SPM they go write milk protein in their schema, so better to say casein. So they'll coagulate it, means like 蒙包凝固它起来 so it become like creamy punya texture. But you have to explain a lot to produce yogurt. Then, now, the last one, last type of question here they will ask, which, okay, look, last two, got two more. Another one is plants, paddy plants. So back to alcohol fermentation. Plants, in general, will undergo alcohol fermentation when they are underwater. Sorry, the diagram here, I don't know go where already. So let's say when they are underwater, let's say flooded. So they can't breathe underwater. They're not like fish, like human, we can't breathe underwater. So they are then forced to undergo fermentation because there are no oxygen. However, alcohol fermentation produces ethanol, which is toxic, which causes the plant to die. So if they are underwater for too long, plants can die. But however, paddy, they won't die. They can sustain in this kind of environment. They can resist to this kind of thing. Why? Okay, number one, remember, okay, so they want you to explain quite a lot. So number one, you can say alcohol fermentation first. So you can say, number one, in waterlogged area, there's no oxygen. So therefore, it will carry out alcohol fermentation. Okay, then, of course, you mentioned ethanol produced is toxic. But why they won't die compared to normal plants? Then here comes the main thing, because they can produce a kind of enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. So when it comes to paddy plant question, this is definitely a thing that they want you to explain. Why they can survive in water unlike other plants? Because they can produce a special kind of enzyme, which this enzyme basically breaks down the ethanol. So that's the next thing you say, which breaks down ethanol into CO2 and its release out from the plant. That's why you have to mention. So remember, when it comes to paddy question, these two are the main things. The enzyme breaks down the ethanol, so it won't accumulate in the plant, which causes them to die. And finally, difference between our aerobic respiration and lactic acid fermentation, similarities and difference. So let's start with the similarities first. So basically, both are processes which uses glucose to produce energy, right? Both are respiration. So you can say both involves the breaking down of glucose into energy. You can say both needs the cytoplasm, right? Because both, okay, first you can say both glycolysis. Both process involve glycolysis. So regardless whether there's oxygen or not, respiration, aerobic or fermentation, you first need glycolysis, break down the glucose into pyruvate, which means both of the process begins in the cytoplasm, right? So both begins in cytoplasm. And that's about it. Now, for differences, remember, in essay, if they give you unknown, they didn't name the process here. Naming the process got marks, right? So, aerobic respiration. This is lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so let's write out the equation because we compare the equation first now. Oxygen, glucose, energy, CO2, water. Glucose, lactic acid, energy. So the first thing you can see in front here, one got energy, oxygen, one does not require oxygen. That's the first thing you can see. And I think is when you have oxygen, you completely oxidize the glucose. That's why you get more energy. Like you cut oxygen basically like a knife. You cut down the glucose into smaller pieces. You break down even more. So basically, you can say glucose is completely oxidized. This one, glucose. Don't use the word oxidized really. This one is because there's no oxygen. It's partially broken down. Okay, now for the products, let's talk about energy first. Right, the amount of energy. The energy produced here is 2898 kilojoule. Energy. This is 150. Now, then for the remaining things, right now, this is what our textbook gives us, and this is also what the marking scheme write exactly like the textbook. So pay attention. Okay, number one, they say that water basically produces water, does not produce water. Yeah, believe it or not, this is a legit answer. And next they say, because your glucose is completely oxidized, you produce different byproducts compared to lactic acid in lactic acid fermentation. So for this one, you can say glucose is broken down to produce CO2 and water. It's not like repeating this, but yeah, this is legit two different points. This one, glucose is broken down to produce lactic acid. Okay, so basically, for the equation, you can really write a lot of things. On top of that, next you can say, where does it occur? Occurs in cytoplasm, glycolysis, but it also have oxygen, meaning it will also occur in your mitochondria. That's the main part. Actually, this is the last one already. This one don't have 7 difference. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes, this one is occur in cytoplasm only. That's it. I think Form 4 Chapter 7, I did most of the types of question already, which is usually when they ask Form 4 Chapter 7, these are the kind of questions. So, yeah, not very much variety. So, I think this one should be quite simple for you all. So, I will see you guys in my third and final video. So, this third and final video will be out during the Chinese New Year break, right before your Bio SPM. Okay, so goodbye. Good luck.